Hello. Today I chat with Pooja Shah, who was the head of product at Protocol Labs and now leads a kind of a decentralized job and project and reputation marketplace called Radius. And Pooja is, doing really good work. You can think of this as, Pooja's trying to think about how we're going to have these billion person organizations in the future. For something like climate change, we need to coordinate much better on that. And so she is starting to, with her small company right now, starting to kind of move the needle on that around, especially getting these new squads, these new individual folks to kind of like work on these projects in a kind of a better way. And then they get to gain, in a Web3 sense, decentralized reputation, those things that they can then bring with them to other kind of job marketplaces and whatever. And it's a really cool conversation around both like, this history of human coordination from the past to the present on the internet and then to the future, and then also specifically like how Pooja is thinking about coordinating capital and talent and ideas together. And so I just think hopefully Pooja's thoughts get manifest in reality in the next kind of decade or so, because we'll need them to make a human level organism that actually coordinates around these things in a better way. Thanks and enjoy the episode. Hello, Rhys's Pieces. I'm Rhys, the co-founder of Root, and welcome to The Rhys Show. This century is a turning point in human history, and I'm here to help you navigate it. I hope you come away with a new understanding of our scientific, technological, and societal trends that are poised to radically reshape our world, and how you can work with those trends to become a live player in building a solar punk future. And today, I'm excited to chat with Pooja Shah. Pooja was the head of product at Protocol Labs, and now leads Tephra Labs and Radius, which is scaling human coordination, starting with a great project and jobs marketplace. Pooja, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Thanks, Rhys. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, excited to dive in. And this is fun because Pooja and I were chatting about before the show, like Pooja's been heads down, building, which is amazing. And building is very, very necessary. And it's also nice to sometimes zoom out and be like, let's like remind yourself and ourselves about like what you're building and why. And as a note on that, the goal for our listeners is to kind of, tell the story of how humans coordinate. Starting in the past, back in the old days, between 100,000 and 20 years ago, and then also to today, Filecoin, Radius, the internet, all of that, and then like thinking into the future. So let's start actually, Pooja, with like, I guess maybe I want to start with actually your curiosity about how humans coordinate. What got you into like thinking about this kind of stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. Just the question more broadly, I think, is really interesting. And I guess what initially got me into this, I would say I've probably been interested in some form of this question for my entire adult or like independent thinking life, I would say. Maybe starting when I was in high school, I thought a lot about, I thought at the time actually that I wanted to go into to work in government, because I knew that I wanted to make a big impact in solving some of the problems that I thought were the most important to address in the world. And at the time I thought that some of the solutions that our society had developed for creating impact on a really large scale primarily were driven by governmental like regulation and laws and policies. So I think I started thinking about it at the time, and then especially I grew up in the Bay Area in California. So my dad is an engineer, so definitely had a little bit of the influence of technology, and some of the thinking, when I was graduating high school was like the late aughts, I guess people call it, and entered college in the early 2010s, and so thought a lot about what is the role of technology and how it can help solve important problems for people. And so I guess, it really challenged a lot of the way I had thought about the role of government in society and technology in society, and the role of individuals and how they can self-assemble to make change and things like that. So I guess I'd say been thinking about it for a really long time. And most concrete, like for now, I mean, this is what we are hoping to make a really big impact with our work at Tephra Labs and with Radius and other projects that we'll build in the future. And that like more specific interest, I think, was triggered just through my experience in the Web3 space over the last couple of years, seeing some of the very interesting experiments in coordination that have been run. And I think the Web3 space is like fascinating for so many reasons, but I think there have been some like very, very interesting, some successful, some not so successful projects and attempts that people have had to like organize themselves differently that I think have been really informative.
Yeah, it's cool. It's interesting. I mean, it's like, yeah, it's kind of a classic as we grow up and we're like, okay, cool, maybe it's the government, maybe it's technology, whatever. And then it's funny because Web3, and whether you get whatever the world's one gets pilled into, and you're like, oh man, like I'm learning about co-ops, and you're like, whoa, co-ops are a different way to organize, and you're like, wow, that's really
Yeah.
cool. Or you're like, oh wow, Web3, all these people are just organizing in these crazy different ways. And you think about, I was shilling DAOs to someone the other day, and I was like, look,
Mhm.
10 years ago there were zero of these things, and now there's like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. Like, this is crazy. And
Yeah.
that doesn't even count all the like there's no like the Filecoin ecosystem or all these kind of like other ecosystems that
Hmm.
exist at the level.
Hmm.
So tell me, before we get into like the web two, or kind of like the web and web three kind of coordination mechanisms, how do
Sure.
you think about, I don't know, like human collaboration before that, like the old classic people
Hmm.
hanging out around the fire, or like how do you think about, what are the core primitives of how we as humans like do the thing that we do, which is coordination?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like it's such a complex topic, and actually, like, so yeah, because of this more specific interest that has been developing over the last couple of years, I've been reading a lot about why humans work, like what early societal groups looked like, and how people did kind of coordinate it back in the day when it was just like hunter gatherers and and things like that, and then some of the more modern work as well, especially like once we started moving into the era of corporations and firms and leveraging some of these, and also nation states as well, which are an earlier concept. Like religion is also like, really interesting, and just thinking of religions as massive organizations in a way too, is pretty fascinating. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's really hard to boil down all of that, I would say, into
Good luck,
something.
good luck, good luck. How does it work? How
But
does religions and nation states and companies work? Like, what's going on there?
right. But yeah, but one of the things that I do think is really fascinating is like how some of these technologies that, very broadly defined, some of these technologies that we've like discovered as a species over time have really influenced the way that we coordinate and have really made a change in like the opportunities that were available to us for how we coordinated, that were sort of previously like inconceivable before that technology was developed. So I think like the fact that fire was discovered like a million years ago or whenever it was, and that made it possible for people to not have to work as hard to gain like nutrient dense calories and sustain themselves, made it possible for people to spend a lot more of their time in community and conversing with each other, sort of like dreaming more than they ever were really able to before, but when they were much more focused on survival. And I think, writing is also something that obviously has made it, has been this like huge advancement. And so I think more recently too, in like the last couple hundred years, just like the way that technology has accelerated a lot of like the communications that people that we have in our society. And I think sometimes, especially like once we get to the more recent, especially for what we're doing now with Tephra Labs and Radius, I'll get questions a lot of the time around, Ronald Coase's theory of the firm, and the reason firms exist is, and like why there are these gigantic groups of people that all work for the same employer and are sort of like centrally coordinated. The reason those things exist is to reduce like the transaction costs of actually like coordinating human labor. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But, that theory came about in like the 1940s. And there's so much that has happened since then, right? Like the internet was not even a concept really like back then. And so I think like it's really interesting that all of these like new technologies, I think really unlock a huge like wave of potential really for how we think about what people can do to like collaborate with each other and coordinate amongst ourselves, which is really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think it's, I mean, one piece of it is interesting, which is, yeah, thinking about something like fire, as there's the part of fire that gives
Mm-hmm.
us more energy, where we have our external stomach, aka the fire, doing the thing, and
Yeah.
then that gives us both more time, but also it just kind of forces us to like hang out around the thing, where it's like it's
Yeah.
cold. Before stuff in the north that much, but now we're going more north, and now we can just hang out. We're kind of forced to do this awake dreaming with each other, aka talking.
Totally.
Like, how's your meat, or whatever.
Yep.
And then eventually you get to Christianity, and
It
um,
skips a few steps, but yeah,
yeah,
perfect.
exactly. So that's interesting, and I think yes, and I think I just like as a reminder for folks just to I don't know. There's kind of a lens here about like seeing everything as technology, and I think that we're
Mhm.
kind of priced. I don't know, priced. We're just with the water. Technologies. We see them as something that's not yet in the water we swim in. That's
Mhm.
how in.
Mhm.
But that's like, wait
Yeah.
a second. Actually, technologies are, buildings and blah blah. Not just digital technology, and
Mhm.
actually, technology are also something like a religion or this idea of a
Mhm.
monotheism. Or those are also technologies, things that like help
Mhm.
us. They're just tools to get shit done or whatever. Um,
Definitely.
and
Yeah.
it's also interesting, yeah, Cosi, I feel like that's part of everybody's kind of like speed running or whatever of the idea maze, where you're like, okay, I'm trying to do human coordination in Web3. Eventually, you're like, okay, Cosi and stuff. Oh,
Yeah.
transaction costs, cool, cool, cool. So how do you so thinking about I don't know like the internet
Mhm.
and maybe even just pre Web3 stuff. How do you think about how humans coordinate on the internet? What does the internet enable us to do?
Mhm.
Wikipedia, Facebook, all that kind of stuff, Reddit. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, there's been so much. Obviously, I would say like the biggest thing is just like the I would say it's like communication and also like the globalization of basically networks. Not globalization the way that people used to talk about it. I guess like I haven't really heard that form of the word globalization in a long time, but don't want to confuse folks. More just like the ease with which you can create global networks. Is something that has been like really fascinating. And I would say, so many people when talking about future of work type of stuff now, obviously like the COVID pandemic had a lot of folks have talked about that as a really interesting accelerant for some of the trends that folks were hoping or thought that the internet made possible, and then living in a COVID world, it just really accelerated us as a society leaning on some of those like internet native networks and communication mechanisms. But I think some of like what really becomes possible is it's just like it's just amazing to me to see like the breadth of types of like activities that people try to coordinate via the internet today. You have something that's like as granular as an Amazon Mechanical Turk like task, which pays a couple of cents for a couple of seconds of someone's time and attention, all the way to the sorts of like projects where people are crowdfunding like millions, tens of millions of dollars with like strangers from around the world to support something in non-equity funding a lot of the time to support something just like a dream that they have, and that they've been able to tell a compelling story around, and where there's like so much more trust in that sort of transaction, but it's like kind of enables this like group of people to be united with some sort of cause. And I think all of that has like that breadth of complexity and scope is something that is just like possible today that I feel like wasn't really possible to do before. And it's also really cool to see. I mean, even with like new projects, and I think this is true in some spaces more than others, because I think a lot of this is influenced by like the culture of particular geographies, and that's not totally, the internet hasn't totally destroyed like geographic culture and geographic boundaries. And of course, even though there are definitely such things, I believe, as like internet native cultures, but I think just like the fact that it's possible to create communities, even when a project is very small, of just like a couple dozen people or a couple hundred people who really are from all around the world, because it's just so much easier today, or it's just possible, I guess I would say today, to like broadcast and provide these types of opportunities and give visibility to these types of opportunities equally to anyone, regardless of sort of where they're based. And that could be anything from like playing a game with friends to like actually finding a new job opportunity, and all of that is sort of enabled. So yeah, I mean, I think very broadly, I feel like this period in time, and I think it's not just for like how we think about how we work, but it's also like how we form personal relationships and how we think about what is going to fulfill us, just like in terms of personal hobbies and all sorts of things. It feels like this era that we're living in is characterized by so much more like freedom and autonomy, and choice. And I don't think the internet is solely responsible for that, but I think, there's a lot of the reason why we have that, I think, today is just because of our like global connectivity that's powered by the internet.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it's interesting because like when you just change, if you change the underlying informational substrate, just like so many things change. And I think it's interesting because
Totally.
I think I like what you're saying about the there is a people think a lot about like the long tail of like
Hmm.
subreddits or whatever, where you're like, okay,
Yeah.
cool. You can get into this, like, for the LGBTQ plus folks who are in Omaha,
Hmm.
Nebraska or whatever. It's like, oh man, they can actually like hang out with people now. And like, and
Hmm.
also vice versa, where it's like, hey, you're like some random incel or whatever.
Yeah.
And like you can also hang out. And so I think,
Yeah.
I think that long tail is interesting, but what you were talking about is more of like
Hmm.
the long tail, what I would call like the long tail of
Hmm.
communications primitives or something.
Hmm.
This guy
Hmm.
Eugene Wei talks about these social media primitives, something like the like, the comment, the
Hmm.
TikTok duet. And what you're talking about is like, hey, here's this primitive, which is the Upwork, Amazon, etc. Kind of like simple a task for money primitive
Hmm.
versus the GoFundMe primitive, which is a vision for money, and so thinking about those different kind of APIs that all kind of emerge as kind of
Hmm.
subsets of these kind of mimetic, or sorry, these like communications primitives that exist, that I
Hmm.
like that framing. I think
Yeah.
the other thing that you were talking about there, which I think is true, is like, you're talking a lot, in Tephra and Join Radius are all about, or in Radius are all about
Hmm.
work.
Hmm.
But it's like there's these different jobs to be done, where there's work,
Hmm.
the kind of now me kind of money piece. There's also relationships, the kind of now us, like how you hang out with people. And there's also
Hmm.
like the future me, like what is meaning and purpose for me? What are my hobbies
Yeah.
or whatever? So it's just like there's
Yeah.
all these different jobs that the internet does.
Hmm.
so
Totally.
so how do you think about okay, so we had back in the day, we were
Hmm.
chilling, we have these new technologies,
Hmm.
aka how like just like the idea of coordination, we were kind of learning how to coordinate in these different ways. And then we
Hmm.
have the internet, which gives us all these new kind of primitives, and new APIs for coordination,
Hmm.
and to do these jobs to be done. So
Yeah.
now we're in Web3 land. Tell
Hmm.
us, what is Radius, what is Tephra Labs, what are y'all doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yes. And actually, one thing I would love to return to
Yeah.
later from what you just mentioned, I think like thinking about sort of these different roles, to the first part, I think you had made 2 points in the first one about this kind of more like vision led, and the other maybe more like task led, a little bit like these are, I think that's like really interesting thinking also about within the work context, what are these different avenues that people have to sort of um, efficiently allocate talent, capital, and ideas, and like matchmake between those things. It's one of the ways I actually have started thinking about what we're trying to do with Radius and Tephra Labs as well. So kind of relates to what I will now
Mm,
talk about. But yeah, so I guess I'll say that, so Tephra Labs, the way that I describe what our mission is to build infrastructure for large scale human coordination. And really the reason and I'm happy to share, why we basically backed into that as the right mission for us to solve. That's not really where we started. But the reason we thought it ended up making sense, or something that was like really needed in this century, is just because looking at like the scale of some of the challenges, and also some of the opportunities that face us as a species, some of these things are just massive, and they're the sorts of things that touch every single person on the planet in a way that everyone probably does care about, or like should care about if they don't already. And just looking at like the sort of structures that are dominant today for how this sort of like mass scale coordination happens at the moment, it's either some of these more formal structures like corporations or governments, or maybe even intergovernmental organizations like the UN and the various sort of internation state treaties and things like this, or maybe sometimes like the more grassroots sort of activist efforts that come up every now and then, which are really hard to get off the ground, but some of them do succeed occasionally. And even like the most successful of these, like the largest companies in the world and the largest governments in the world, right? Still, like, depends on how you define it. I guess, governments theoretically could govern like billions of people, like some of, like China and India, but also just like thinking about the folks who are directly on the ground, like supporting the missions of these like various organizations. The largest organizations are like a few million people in size. It's not really much larger than that. Whereas for some of the scale of like challenges that are ahead for us, we really believe that some of these things are going to require like hundreds of millions of people to directly work together to make stuff happen and to like solve hard problems. So that's like, something that we think is really important. I think probably a lot of people think that that is important. And one of the things that, as we were thinking about this, just like laying out the structure of the argument, it sort of felt like, well, when we're in this future where there are hundreds of millions of people or potentially billions of people that are working together to enable change or to make change, some sort of change happen, those people are not all going to work for this. Like, it doesn't make sense for like all those people to be employed by the same company or to all live in the same country, right? Or whatever, like these formal coordination structures, like it just doesn't make sense. It's hard to envision how those sorts of structures will scale to like that level of ownership over that many lives. And also it doesn't make sense for, I think, a lot of reasons, and also happy to chat about that some more. So we were thinking, well, really, a lot of the folks that are going to be working on this are going to be like, small teams of people or like individuals who are just like looking for ways in which they can contribute. And so that got us really interested in thinking about the independent work economy, and like also seeing that as kind of something that has like grown as a change in working preferences for people today, where, like a few decades ago, there were people who would basically like the generation of like our grandparents would be at a company for their entire lives. And today it's like very common for people to completely change careers, let alone, let alone change jobs. Right. And like that's going even further now with, I saw some interesting statistics like a few months ago about Gen Z, and I'm not Gen Z, I'm a millennial, but Gen Z increasingly is.
What are the Gen Z kids doing? What are they doing these days?
I know.
They still TikTok.
But it's really fascinating to see how like the preference for independent work is correlated with youth as well. And like, Gen Z prefers independent work much more than any other prior generation. And the majority of Gen Z workers today are actually independent workers. And that's like by choice rather than being required to do that for whatever reason, like they couldn't get a full-time job or something, or like be a full-time employee somewhere. So it's kind of like, a bunch of things that we're sort of, we think that like the independent work economy is a really important and growing workforce. And today it's really hard to be an independent worker. And so that's something that we care about a lot at Tephra Labs as well. And what we're trying to do with Radius is, and I've been talking for a while, so maybe I'll just say a quick thing and then we can kind of dive into whatever is interesting. But with Radius, it's sort of like trying to build a first experiment in which we can basically provide visibility on the sorts of high impact opportunities that folks with funding in various like spaces. Right now we're focusing on Web3, are looking for people to actually make an impact on, and then doing a lot of the work to kind of like find the right teams and support them and prepare them so that they can actually like nail those opportunities. And that's like a little bit of the supporting independent work as like a way of working and making an impact, but also like working on meaningful things without having to be a full-time employee somewhere, but also like, moving the needle in doing so. And there being a lot of like other secondary benefits for someone's career and like their future prospects as well. Okay,
interesting. Yeah, lots of good stuff there. I think, so yeah, so you guys, and again, I love the, and I just shielded this on Twitter, but yeah, you guys are doing a, your mission or whatever is to infrastructure to enable the first billion person organizations in human history,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it's like, that's good. That's a good little mimetic, or you're like, ooh, that could be fun. And it's interesting though, where you have this, it's obviously painfully obvious when you think about something like,
Mm-hmm.
you're chatting about before the show, like carbon dioxide removal and climate change and all that stuff. It's like, okay, how do we, that should be done both at the company level, it should be done at the government level, but it should also be done in this weird kind of new tech tree or whatever level of like, hey, here's like stuff that we're all trying to tackle, and how do we get people to like tackle those crucial bits of this like bigger kind of organism level thing that we're trying to tackle here. It also, some of the things that you're saying too are like, And actually, I have a sub question on this, which is, you were chatting about there's the individual level, and I
Mhm.
hadn't heard the meme, by the way, of individual worker economy. What did you say for
Oh
that? Was
yeah, independent work economy. Yeah,
independent work economy? Sorry, the independent work economy.
yeah.
Um, it's yeah, it's I guess I want to do a couple things. The first question I actually have is, so there's at one level you have a billion people coordinating around climate change or whatever.
Hmm.
Or you have like just an individual person. In the
Hmm.
middle you have like the 8-person kind of Amazon 2 pizza team, and then you have
Hmm.
like the 150 person Dunbar number stuff. How do you think about that scale of like how
Hmm.
people from 1 to 1 billion, what are the different like levels?
Mm. Oh yeah, that's a super interesting question. Yeah, so I think one of the things this is just sort of like a hypothesis, I guess I would say, for how like again organizational structures might evolve going forward. But I do think, and actually it's been really interesting to see this kind of with Radius already. But I think that increasingly we're going to see like small groups like that are able to, that don't really look like any sort of structure we've seen before in the
They're a
world,
squad.
because
They're a
yeah, they're
squad.
a squad, exactly. Um, and actually, like there's a really great like talk which I can send a link for after this. You may be familiar with this as well, but it's about this concept of flash teams. And this talk is by Melissa Valentine, who is a researcher, I believe, at Stanford. And the idea, I think this talk is from like a few years ago, so it's not even a very new concept at this point. But the idea is like thinking about, they basically wanted to like, and this is also the idea of flash teams. I think like some examples of this that already is like how certain parts of the world work. It's like how disaster response works in the world today, and also in Hollywood, like a lot of film production and like the way that kind of crews are assembled as needed on a project basis, sort of like follows the structure a little bit too. But it's basically this idea of being able to share like openly that this is sort of like the team that needs to be assembled. These are kind of like the roles that we're looking for, and then basically being able to have people like come together, fill a particular role, work on a project, and then kind of like disband, I guess, when it's done. Or maybe in some cases they'll continue to like work together if they really liked it or whatever, or but just like this idea of there being these like much more flexible team structures. And it's like very interesting because it sounds like a cool idea, and maybe an initial reaction would be like, oh, cool idea, but how does that even work in practice? But the reality is like this is literally how there are like parts of the world that's how it works today. And I think that the cool thing about the flash team research is like showing how this can also work in spaces where like software development, for example, or product development, where it feels like it's really important for there to be a lot of context on a lot of prior knowledge that people need to have before they can contribute something valuable to a project, and showing that like, yes, that is true, but there are ways to still like, achieve an impact with these kind of more flexible structures. So yeah, I mean, I would say that I think like in terms of, I would say today we have like a lot more of these much larger sort of like, there's been a lot of consolidation forces in the world over like the last several decades that I think in the future, I think if we create the right systems, it'll be possible to enable these much more, either these like sort of flash team structures, which could be really of any size theoretically, but like probably will work best at smaller scales, probably like less than like 20 people or so, and or just like these pods or squads of people that are just like impact hunters or something, like looking for cool cool work that they can do, and they like each other, but they're yeah not necessarily looking to like incorporate as a company or anything like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's yeah, and just like I can hear my mom rolling in her grave where she's just hearing about flash teams and impact hunters or whatever, where it's just like can't you get a real job, and you're like, but mom, I work on an impact hunter flash team, it's like, what is that? Um, so the other thing it makes me think about is the size of the organization versus, my question was kind of about
Yeah.
size, and your answer
Hmm.
was not wrongly, was kind of about
Hmm.
amount of time that it exists for. So maybe there's some kind
Hmm.
of like two-dimensional grid there. So
Hmm.
tell me about this independent the other thing it makes me think of is the kind of movement versus mob idea. And
Hmm.
there's like flash mobs, and flash
Hmm.
mobs were a thing that only emerged, but it didn't have the long-term kind of long-term capital needed to keep the mob around, and there's no real
Yeah.
reason to. But a Flash team is this thing that like is taking in capital. It has capital to kind of continue doing its stuff. It's like it's just kind of like a capital driven thing instead of just like a purely like mimetic. Hey, we're just gonna like do this big
Yeah.
Flash mob. We're just gonna do the Arab Spring or whatever. But then where's the long-term capital building that is necessary? So that makes you think of that. So I think talk about this independent work economy. Is that the word? Okay, independent work economy. What is that? How is that different than the gig economy, than
Yeah.
consulting stuff? You know, how do you think about the independent work economy?
Yeah, yeah. So, and I don't really know. I don't think most people describe this world, I guess, in this way. So,
Okay, got
I
it, got
think
it.
it's like it's not really like a thing,
Okay, got
but
it.
it is how I like to describe it, because I think, yeah, I would say all of what you are describing. So, like, yeah, gig workers and folks who are consultants or freelancers, or like independent contractors. I would say all of those, or even like I would even put kind of like agencies or folks that like really kind of have this service model of how they engage with like many different groups simultaneously. I would kind of put a bunch of those into this bucket of independent workers. And really, yeah, the idea is just like fundamentally, it's just working engagements in which someone is like doing something really valuable for some organization or some like group that's paying them to do the work. And if we want to get like nuance, the payment could be in financial capital. It could also be in like reputational capital or something else as well. But yeah, they're in some way being compensated to perform some meaningful work for some entity, and but they aren't like full-time employed by that entity. And I think that there are some meaningful. It to me, like the more that I've been in this world, employment versus being an independent worker feels like it should just be an implementation detail. But it's like very interesting. Like the more you go into it, just like the number of protections that kind of exist for employees that like don't really exist in the same way for independent workers today. And some of the requirements and like regulations around full-time employment and what's required. I'm most familiar with some of this in the context of the US. I'm not really sure how it is globally, but my expectation is it's probably similar. And so it creates, even though it feels like it should just be an implementation detail, in practice, like the implementation of these things looks really, really different, and creates a lot of friction to engaging folks on an independent basis, even if you would be interested in doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes me think of and even my org yesterday, we were chatting about, oh, we have stuff in California, but then healthcare in Texas. So in the healthcare in Texas is, and so we're thinking about moving to a PEO.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, and then the PEO it aggregates a bunch of people, and then you get to
Yeah.
choose among your healthcare plans. And so
Yeah.
it is kind of, it's just a weird thing where it's like, yeah, it would be nice if it was an implementation detail where just obviously these are issues with America, healthcare and 401ks and stuff like that just like kind
Yeah.
of came baked in either from the government or from the kind of ecosystem of work. But instead you have to, yeah, full-time employees are like real employees, while like the contractors are, you're kind of like, oh, like we don't give you anything. So tell us
Yeah.
about, so Radius. So what it's a, and tell me, I guess for me, there's like either two ways. Yes. So what is it and how is it different from, I'm thinking about like other just like job boards that exist and
Yeah.
other stuff. Yeah, both job boards that exist, but also other things in the Web3 world that are kind of like the rabbit holes and stuff of the world. How do you kind of think about Radius versus other work platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, I guess like the way that I would describe Radius is it's really like a product to help. This is why I've kind of started calling it the like talent capital and ideas coordination mechanism or allocation mechanism, which is really like that. When I say that, what I mean is that there are people who have financial capital that they're looking to use to fund important work. That they think is going to make an impact or generate value. There are people, the talent, that are looking for those sorts of like high impact or like just fun, satisfying opportunities. And there are the ideas themselves. Generally, like the capital historically has been tied to the ideas, but they're not always. They don't always need to be like exactly coming from the same source. But the ideas are just sort of like, yeah, what are these projects? And that can come in the case when we were talking about before with like crowdfunding as an example, that's, like the talent has the idea for something that's like really potentially meaningful. And so that's like at a very high level, I would say like what we want Radius to be is like a really efficient platform that can help connect like these sort of three sides of a a marketplace. Today, what Radius is in practice, like, and I guess how I would say it's like different from, because we're still early, we're still working on building out a lot of those components. But I'd say like how it's different is that we're really focused on, I would say like on projects and not really focused as much on like helping people find someone for a particular role. We're really trying to keep it at the level of like, yeah, this is sort of like a project that needs someone to build it out. And as a result of that, it's been really interesting to see, because I think like a lot of these, talent marketplace type projects that do exist today are much more focused on supporting individuals. So like you mentioned Rabbit Hole as an example, like Gitcoin also has, like a bounties platform, and there's like Dwork and the Web3 space. And obviously in the Web2 space, there's like Upwork and a bunch of, there's just like Brain Trust and a bunch of these other platforms like Fiverr, et cetera. And I would say like most of those are really focused on finding individuals to like do something, even if it's, I would say like bounties as an example are also projects. They're much smaller projects. They're like bite-sized tasks, not as small as like Mechanical Turk tasks, but much smaller than like a full project. But everything is like focused on individuals. And one of the things that we really believe is that some of the most impactful stuff is going to occur with like these small teams, as I kind of mentioned, as the right unit of worker. And that's really what we've seen on Radius. Like today, I would say the average project size in terms of the like financial reward for completing it is about $30,000 right now. So it's, it's not where the average, like maybe bounty size or something like that is like tens of dollars or a couple $100, something like that. So it's like been very interesting to see that some of these projects, which are like, they're more lucrative, they're also longer term. They are slightly like they tend to be like more complex. Often it's like building entire products or building like really important pieces of protocol layers or product layers or infrastructure, whatever it is. That's the sort of work that's a much better, that requires like many skill sets that often don't coexist within the same human. So that's something that I think we've seen be really interesting with Radius, is like helping to support the creation of these, I guess we could call them like flash teams, although sometimes the teams are more stable. But yeah, teams that are like looking for these high impact projects to work on.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes me think about, the talent capital ideas piece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like, yeah, it's funny. There's like only so many, like, I think from like a meta-mimetic perspective about like the different ways that you can think about things. And one of them is there's two things, and that could be
Mm-hmm.
a marketplace or with supply and demand, capital on one
Mm-hmm.
side and talent on the other side, or you can make a three-legged stool and add
Yeah.
ideas in there.
Yeah.
And as you said, the ideas are kind of, they're often, the capital usually gets to determine is like,
Mm-hmm.
I want to work on this, but that doesn't necessarily have to be true. And something like whether it's quadratic funding or all these things are like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, the capital just goes into a pool, and then
Yeah.
there's another mechanism for kind of allocating it for the talented people to work on ideas or whatever. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
like we don't have to have those coupled. And it's also interesting, yeah, as you say, that's like, it's funny how, and we've kind of been talking around this the whole time, but this there's like an early internet meme,
Mm-hmm.
which was networked individualism,
Mm-hmm.
where it did both. It was this massive new network, but it was also individualism. And
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting as we kind of move through space, where it's like, when I think about Upwork and all in the gig economy and Uber and Lyft, like all of those things are very based on the individual. And it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like this is in some ways based on the team,
Mm-hmm.
or is more kind of, can be just because it's a bigger size. And so it can be
Yeah.
more team based. Do
Yeah.
these teams, how do they just like find each other and hang out, and like, but they're, how do these
Yeah.
teams form? And I
Yeah.
guess, are you thinking, are there other examples of platforms that do it at the team level instead of the project level, or instead of the person level?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Yeah. So in terms of like how the teams today sort of form, most of the teams are like groups that sort of exist already as teams in the world. And in some cases, they are like actually incorporated as like little companies or whatever. Sometimes they're not, though. Like we have had a couple of cases in which someone actually like reached out in our like Discord server, and also like emailed some of the folks on the Radius team saying that they were interested in working on this project, and they were like, oh, do you know any other people who kind of have these skill sets that like I could partner with? And so today, like I would say for the most part, it's teams that already kind of know each other. But one of the things that we are very interested in enabling is this like ability for people to form teams as needed in order to complete a project. And in terms of like, are there other systems that exist like this in the world today? I mean, I think one other startup that I've heard of is called A Team, which kind of also is like sort of focused on enabling teams of people to work on projects. It's, you know, like a Web2 startup, but I think is also like, I feel like some of the,
Boo.
I think
No, we love Wait. Some of our best friends work in Web 2. Yeah.
yes, definitely. Nothing against Web2. The only reason I mentioned that is just because I think that it makes it difficult to have like a fully open marketplace sort of approach with, if you're going to take, I think, like a very Web2 approach as well. Like it just feels like it's harder. There's certain things because in order to like control for quality, which is important, right? Like you want these projects to be successful. That's important for everyone. And I think the way a lot of more like traditionally companies have kind of approached this is like vetting a lot of the people up front and saying, oh yeah, this is, you know, this person is part of our like qualified pool of talent or whatever. I don't like that for a number of reasons. It feels weird to me to feel like it feels like there's, again, this like ownership over the human, that they're like part of your pool of talent or, you know, which really they're their own like autonomous agent and should be able to do whatever they want. They don't belong to you as the company. So, but I also, you know, I think it's like a reasonable short-term solution to try to address some of these like quality controlled needs. But I think one of the things that's really cool is like some of the primitives that Web3 enables, I think can help you solve those sorts of like quality concerns and solve some of the information asymmetry problem in these types of open markets in a way that is really hard to do with like proprietary technology. So
let's double click on that because I think it's really interesting, and I think it is funny. It's like if I'm on it's back to the, you know, does Twitter own my handle or do I own the handle? Am I part of, if I go and Airbnb puts they brand, not to brand is maybe a little bit too intense, but they put a thing onto me that says you are a super user, you're a super host or whatever, and then you're kind of, you know, they're kind of pushing that onto you instead of you kind of as a self-sovereign individual. So tell me about like like long term, and this gets into the concepts of identity and reputation and the concepts of a protocol. Like, how are you thinking about building out the protocol, and will all idea and capital and talent just like go through the kind of Radius protocol in the future, and then everybody will have their own individual thing, self-sovereign identity through like how will that work?
I'm glad we're talking about this. I know, you know, this is something I'm like extremely excited about. And I mean, I think like one of the things that we believe is extremely important is that people, this is the vision I think a lot of people have for the internet, and increasingly so today, but that people are self-sovereign and that they own their data. And they actually feel, you know, I think there's already this sort of like loose notion that we do own our actual experiences. But when you're interacting with like a couple dozen of these like digital platforms, and you have like different accounts and different profiles on these different platforms, they don't talk to each other. You can't really easily extract your data from any of them, even though it's all about you and it's like about work that you've done or experiences that you've had. It kind of feels like you don't own it, even though technically you should, and you sort of loosely do. And so I think that's something that we believe is extremely important. And when we think about like, you know, in the future, what we want to build. So today we're taking this, what we've been calling, and actually it's interesting because in the Farcaster community as well, they've also been describing it this way as sort of like product-led protocol development. That was sort of like independent. It's really cool that they've also kind of arrived at a similar approach. But sort of starting by building something that we think that this what we're trying to accomplish today with Radius is there's a lot of pieces to it. It's like really important in and of itself. But it's also like one of many possible ways that we might think about helping people find each other and find like great opportunities and find capital to support what they're looking to build and things like that. So we think there are a number of other use cases that do this sort of like talent capital allocation trifecta. And that's really what we want to build a protocol for. We think, first of all, it's going to like actually help us solve the core problem that Radius is trying to solve in the right way. But it'll also help like support the groundwork for a number of these other use cases. And I think that that's really important because when we talk about building the infrastructure for like billion-person organizations, I think you kind of do need something that enables you to to have visibility into the billions of people who are like interested in working on climate change or whatever it is. And I don't think the way that anyone's going to get there is by trying to build a centralized product. So I think like, the protocol approach feels like really the right one for us. And but for us, like it's also, there's still a lot that we are a lot of open questions for how we think this protocol should be built. Realistically, it'll probably be a set of related, and like sibling protocols that kind of talk to each other, but that are ultimately composable with each other and with other protocols that do similar or, really like also relevant things. But yeah, some of the types of problems we've been thinking about are around identity and reputation, and how to really enable people to have the full control over that and be able to kind of carry their, starting with their sort of like professional experiences and their educational experiences, and kind of carrying that with them from application to application and community to community. And also, like, thinking about some of the healthy behaviors that we think are important to see in these types of like more open marketplaces, and creating some of the like economic incentives that we think are going to make it more likely that we'll see really high quality outcomes in these types of like arm's length engagements. And then in general, just like more open data protocols, like another thing, which is like a small gripe that I have with like a lot of how, again, centralized technology works today, is like, it's kind of, if you post a job description or something on like Indeed, and then you try to like post it somewhere else, like you have to like literally do the same thing twice, even though you own, like, it should just, it doesn't belong to Indeed or to Lever or to whatever else, right? Like that data is yours or your company's or whatever it is. And so I think in general, we just want to create more of these like open data protocols that kind of like remove, in a way, the ability for platforms to monetize based on the data that really should belong to their users, and then hopefully will force like products to compete on something else, like UX and like how do they treat their community and something like that. And you think there are lots of reasons why that type of stuff might work, because it helps like bootstrap new products like more easily and things like that too. But there's still lots of questions to figure out there. So yeah, I'd say it's like the economic incentives, identity, reputation, and this kind of like open set of open data protocols are kind of the main things we're thinking about on the protocol side at the moment.
Cool. Economic incentives, identity and reputation, and then the kind of open data. Yeah, it's interesting because I think I was yeah, I love the gripes. I also just love like Web 2, Web 3. Just the fact that it's Web 3 is a higher number than Web 2. If it was just reversed, then we would feel like, oh, we're the lesser one, but like it's better than 2, duh.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because I do think it makes me think of a couple things. One is just information asymmetries. I think it's great that you brought that up. I think this guy, David Christian, who thinks at a big history level, he is the main thing when you think about an organism like us. We have a multicellular organism. We're clonal. All of our things are clones of each other. And what we have is our whole nervous system is really good. There's no information asymmetry. Everybody in the crew lets anybody else know, oh my God, I punched myself in the face. Like, I don't punch myself in the face that often because I know that like my fist is here. I should like dodge it or whatever. And so I think as a people, as a societal organism, we need to actually have essentially no information asymmetries. It also makes me think of your Lever Indeed example. Is funny because, I love this meme of like social media networks these days are just screenshots from one of the networks posted on the other 5 networks. And so it's like,
so true, yeah.
all of Reddit is just like, here's these tweets, and all of Twitter is just like, here's this TikTok, and like all of Facebook. So it's just like, it's dumb and nothing's interoperable, and it should change. So as we wrap here, the final question I want to ask is, let's do a quick underrated, overrated. And so I'm just going to say a thing, and you'll give me the one sentence version of, hey, this is overrated because blah, blah. Let's start with job boards. Are job boards underrated or overrated?
I think job boards are probably, I think the right answer, given what we're trying to build, is overrated, just because, again, they kind of fall victim to this centralization curse. But I think generally speaking, I feel like people hate job boards, like all people. The people who have to like apply to jobs, the people who use them to find people. So from that perspective, maybe they're underrated.
Yeah, it's interesting because it feels weird because I've read something that's like 50% of jobs come through just a friend or whatever, a
Yeah.
network, and it's the 50% of good jobs. Like all the bad jobs, like working at McDonald's or whatever, all go through the
Yeah.
job board. So it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know, something weird there.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think about like, reputation? Is like it's kind of is reputation overrated or underrated?
I actually think this is super overrated, especially in the Web3 space. I think there are people have lots of opinions about like the right way to compute reputation. And I think most of the projects that I've seen that are trying to do this in Web3 or outside of Web3 have like a pretty, rigid, again, highly opinionated view of this, and I think pretty much every single approach is going to be wrong. It's going to be, I don't know, maybe it's a hot take because obviously like Google in a way is kind of like enabling reputation for like content on the internet. And that was obviously a very effective algorithm. But I think my general take is that I think it's pretty overrated, and the right thing to do is instead to build systems that support a marketplace of approaches or just like a broad variety of approaches as opposed to like going all in on one.
Yeah, that makes sense. Both having a protocol or whatever, an ecosystem, a marketplace of reputational weightings, and then also
Yeah.
stuff beyond reputation itself. And then the final one, this one is like, and especially maybe within, I don't know, is the meme of human coordination, is that overrated or underrated?
I think this one is also a little bit overrated, but it's belovingly overrated. I think a lot of the people who talk about it all the time are truly passionate about it, really trying to make a big impact, and are genuinely good people. But I think it's like one of those things. I think there's a risk to it becoming a space that begins to feel like not very tractable, because we're spending all the time talking about like the memes and not, real things and real examples and like practical ideas. And there's always a little bit of this disillusionment that happens when we go from like, oh yes, we agree the world is broken, to like a practical idea. And then people are like, oh, this sucks. Like, this is lame. Why are we talking about this? And I think obviously the reality is we have to talk about those things. Like the details are, where we're going to actually solve the problem. So, but yeah, I think the meme has become a little bit overblown.
Yeah. It is funny because people get very we love talking about human coordination. It's so fun, and then it can get a little bit too much like intellectual masturbation. But any case, yeah. So thank you for chatting today, Pooja. And if you want to check out Pooja, she's on Twitter at POOJA_ETH at Twitter. You can also go to join Radius and radius.space if you have a squad, or if you don't have a squad, go there and check out and like start to, I don't know, do some cool work in the Web3 world. As a final note, they're also Radius is hiring for some people. So if you're interested in building the future of not to say it again, but human coordination, then come and hang out. Pooja, do you want to say anything else to our listeners today?
No, I'm just thanks so much for having this conversation, and I would love to chat with anyone who's interested in these topics more. So definitely reach out.
Hit her up. Great. Okay, thank you everybody for listening, and goodbye. Thanks so much for listening today. If you liked the show, please give us a 5-star podcast review or subscribe on YouTube. And if you'd like to chat about this episode with a community of amazing, smart, ambitious, divergent people, come on by and join our Discord. You can find it at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. And then finally, if you'd like to contribute to these ideas being shared more widely in society, you can support the podcast production team at patreon.com/Rhys Lindmark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Thanks, and see you here for the next episode. Bye.